The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Sometimes, I feel like I was destined to be the bad kid. My dad walked out on my mom and I before I could walk, and I remember being angry and confused about it since the moment I could form a thought. To make things worse, my parents decided to name me Dietrich, which is maybe the most skinhead-sounding name you can have. Pair that with some hand-me-down Cochranes and a jean jacket, and you've got yourself a certified red flag. All of this is to say that I was a serious piece of shit kid. I started stealing my mom's cigarettes at 11. I had my first fight at 12. And I probably would have been arrested at 13 if I didn't pin that break-in on my buddy Julian. Mom put up with me the best she could, until I hiked a Dos Equis bottle through the passenger side window of my principal's Chevy and got my second expulsion. It was at this moment that Mom decided serious measures had to be taken before her stupid teen son wound up with an adult-sized rap sheet. Her solution: moving from our little apartment in Cheektowaga all the way to a decrepit crypt just outside of Baltimore. The house had 3 bedrooms, creaking wooden floors, and was way out of Mom's price range. But thankfully that didn't matter, because she had just inherited the place. The house belonged to my grandmother, who I must have met maybe once or twice as a little kid. I have a very distinct memory of telling her she was a shit word because she wouldn't put peanut butter on my bananas. Whatever the reason that drove Grandma away from our little family, it wasn't enough to take us out of the will, even though the house and its inhabitants of dumb pretties, as she called them, was the only thing on it. Mom thought that taking me from one small town to another would be a fresh start. Truth be told, I didn't really care. I didn't have any real friends left back home, and I was already bored of my latest girlfriend, who was some dumb freshman I had no business seeing in the first place. I was 16 and already decided the world was shit, so I didn't give a rat's ass which part of it I ended up in. I spent my first afternoon in the house scuffing up the floors, kicking holes in walls and carving my name into wood that was older than me. Pointless destruction is only entertaining for so long. So after a while I found myself exploring the grounds. I kicked around the weeds in the backyard. I found which of the bathrooms had an actual working toilet. I narrowly stepped on an exposed nail at the top of the staircase. Then I found the 3rd bedroom, the one neither my mother nor I would be sleeping in. This room was full of all of Grandma's dumb pretties, her name for the eclectic collection of shit she gathered in her 80-something years of life. To a respectless teen, there could not be a room full of any uglier, useless doodads in the world, and yet I found myself morbidly curious about each and every one of them. There was a clay figurine of a miner who gave me a good laugh when I twisted his head off and realized his neck was a cork. There were a lot of clocks, none of which ran anymore, a folded flag, and a bunch of little porcelain babies. But above all else, there were dolls. Little, ugly, sackcloth dolls with dead painted expressions. It was all weird, but nothing really surprised me. That is, until I got to the back of the room. I almost hadn't noticed it, but tucked away in a back corner, sitting under a dust-filled beam of light, was a white sheet, draped over what I assumed was a chair. When you make a habit of stealing stuff, you start to look at things a little bit differently than most people. My first thought here was, what could be so valuable that it was the only thing in the room worth protecting from all the dust? I didn't even care what it was, but knowing it was worth something to someone once was enough to pique my curiosity, and without hesitation, I pulled the sheet off. It was another doll. This doll, however, was different from all the rest. It was a woman and would be as tall as one if it stood up, probably standing at least 5'4", or maybe taller. Her body was built more like a puppet than a doll, with ball joints at the wrists and elbows and shoulders, anywhere a person's arms or legs would bend. The doll's silhouette was almost perfect, if not for her arms and legs feeling a bit too long and lanky, and the paint that would be her skin was starting to chip and peel to reveal the wood beneath. That is, everywhere except for her face. My God, her face. I still have trouble describing it now. It was perfect, made of porcelain or something like that, much finer than the wood. If you weren't looking close enough, you'd swear it was the face of a real girl. A young, black woman, to be precise, probably my age or a bit older, with long, curly, real hair falling over her face. That face was flawless, not like the rest of its body, with not even a chip in the paint to break the illusion. I remember reaching my hand out to touch it, but stopping, completely wigged out by the thing. She didn't even have minor imperfections you might find on an actual person's face. She looked like one of those Renaissance statues, unbelievably lifelike to the point of being better than reality. Her cheekbones were perfectly carved or molded onto whatever material the face was made of. Her nose had little nostrils, and her lips even parted ever so slightly into what was almost a smirk. The only thing that broke the illusion were her striking, golden, glass eyes, which stared perfectly forward, lacking in that look of life real people had. My trance was interrupted by the sound of my mom entering the room behind me. "Dietrich, I swear to God if you keep kicking holes in my walls." She saw what I had found, and her face instantly broke into a pout. Her eyes were immediately trained on the doll, and I quickly moved my hand away from it. "What is this thing?" I asked. I didn't have to specify what. "Her name is Calliope," Mom responded. She had a scolding kind of tone, probably hoping I would show more respect to my late grandmother's things. "Your grandmother bought her at a carnival in France when she was about your age. She said she was made by some famous doll maker, and that she had always wanted one of his dolls ever since she was a little girl." "Neat," I said, a bit disinterested now that I had more context. "Yeah, your father always liked her too." It was my turn to pout now. Mom had broken the no dad talk rule, and then had simply walked out of the room with nothing more than a "dinner's at 8." I looked back at the doll. I was now convinced she was nothing more than just that. Some fancy doll bought from a creepy doll maker in France, the homeland of creepy weirdos. My frown deepened a bit as I realized exactly what I was thinking. Did I actually believe she was more than that? It was almost a month later before I thought about Calliope again. I had spent the night drinking with a couple of guys and this girl, Veronica, from my class. It was a pretty uneventful night, but I still remember stealing a couple of six-packs from this guy, Kevin's dad, and that I thought I had a chance of getting with Veronica if the cops hadn't shown up. The rest of it is more or less of a blur, up until I hopped the fence into my own backyard. It was late by that point, probably way past midnight. I had cut through a few neighbors' backyards to be sure that I had lost the cops, but I also didn't want to go through the front door in case Mom was there waiting to lecture me. I fell on my ass coming over the fence, and as I kicked through the weeds and tall grass, I realized I hadn't really been back here yet. It wasn't too hard to find my way around, though, thanks to a big, bright full moon in the sky. As I stumbled towards the house, I remember my leg getting caught in some tall weed, which was strong enough to wrap around my ankle and stop me for a second. As I knelt down to tug myself free, I noticed a weird, white patch in the middle of the yard, reflecting the moonlight. I ran my fingers over it and realized it was concrete, a rectangle foundation, about 4 feet long, with an uneven surface. I figured there must have been a shed there at some point. Got my leg free and went inside. I climbed through the kitchen window and up the staircase towards my bedroom. I thought all of my stealthiness was for nothing when I kicked something in the hallway just outside of my mom's room. She didn't seem to wake up, and I cursed under my breath and carefully made my way past several obstacles in the pitch-black hallway I remember being empty when I left for school that morning. When I got to my room, I went straight to bed, not even taking my shoes off. It wasn't long before I started getting this weird feeling, like I was being watched by someone else in the room. I glanced around, and even though it was dark, I was pretty sure nobody was there. I would have seen them, right, some silhouette of a person, or I would have heard them breathing, or moving, or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling and found myself glancing at a corner of the room just by my dresser. Even when I fell asleep, I would wake up several more times in the night and look back over at that same spot, sure that someone was there watching me. The next morning I knew why when I saw Calliope slumped over in a chair in that very same corner of my room. I marched through the hallway, now tightly packed with boxes of Grandma's doodads, straight to Mom and asked her why that creepy fucking doll was in my room. She rolled her eyes. I need space in that bedroom for my home office, and it sure as hell isn't going in my room or out in the living room to creep out guests. I didn't listen and dragged the doll out into the hallway before going right back to sleep. When I woke up later, she was back in my room, so I dragged her back out again. This cycle repeated for a few days, until eventually I just had to live with the fact that I was always going to wake up to that doll staring at me. I sat there one morning, just staring into her cold, motionless eyes. They were so shiny and perfect, even after all this time, that I could see my own reflection in them. Grandma's weird-ass doll was becoming more than a creepy, unwanted presence in my life. She was becoming an intrusive mockery of my defiance. That night, I decided to get rid of her. I grabbed the doll's arm and dragged her out into the living room. I wasn't just getting rid of the problem. Now I was making a point to Mom, showing her why I wasn't to be fucked with. I laid the doll's head against the bricks of the fireplace and stomped my boot down on her jaw. Instantly, I felt strange, watching that perfect, lifelike face shatter like glass. My dramatic execution felt, for a moment, like it had a real victim. But then seeing the portions of her human face split into uneven pieces was like an uncanny reminder of just how good this inanimate thing was at mimicking life. I know now that in that moment, her little glass eye was staring back up at me. I left the shattered doll and went to sleep. When I woke up, she was back in her chair, as intact as the day I found her. I was quiet at breakfast that morning. I remember I couldn't touch my food and couldn't bring myself to make eye contact with my mother. I didn't say a word when she said, "I'm glad you stopped being stubborn about that doll." I would have thought a boy your age would be thrilled to have a girl in his room. She laughed. I didn't tell her about Calliope. I never believed in the supernatural, but I immediately knew something was wrong with that doll. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared shitless, and I was afraid of what might happen if I went to my mom about the doll. Not that she would even believe me. I made it a rule not to bother Calliope. I wouldn't even touch the doll again, which also made my room a place of never-ending tension. I hated when I had to go in there, and started to sleep on the couch in the living room, or at a friend's house. When eventually I had no choice but to sleep in my own bed again, I would spend hours every night laying awake, staring at the doll, knowing that the moment I looked away, she would get her revenge. Time went on, and the revenge never came. Slowly, I stopped being afraid of Calliope, but I still stared at her. It became less of a defense mechanism and more admiration. I admired the doll for her beauty, how still and perfect her face was, how striking her yellow eyes were behind the sheen of glass. Before long, Calliope was becoming all I could think about. I'd drift off during class, thinking about her eyes. I'd call girls by her name by complete accident. I even became less of a troublemaker, because all I wanted to do at the end of the day was come home and stare at the doll. It wasn't long before I was talking to her, telling her about my day, and even sitting her next to me on the bed as I did so. My head was always clearer around Calliope. She never spoke back, but I could swear she understood everything I was saying, like she understood me, in a way no friend or girl ever had. She didn't need to say anything to prove it. At the same time, I was starting to have nightmares. I dreamt about nails in the floorboards. I dreamt visions of my staircase, growing longer and steeper and darker as I stared at it. I dreamt about a malevolent, faceless being pressing its ear up against my door, a shadow in the backyard beneath the moonlight, and a woman standing at the top of a staircase, staring down at me. The dreams were always obscure, with an ominous feeling about the unclear images I saw in them. This didn't stop me from waking up in a panic, sweat on my forehead and clutching my chest like I might have a heart attack right then and there. Then, I'd look over at Calliope, and everything would be okay. The panic would stop. I'd catch my breath, and I'd be able to fall back asleep knowing that she was watching me sleep. It didn't get by me that my closeness to Calliope was making Mom uncomfortable. Occasionally, she would hear me talking through the door and come in expecting to see a friend or a girl, and instead see Calliope laying limp as ever in her chair. She always looked at the doll with fear, kind of like I looked at her before Calliope and I had started to get along. The look would only get worse when she glanced back at me. The kind of look I'm sure plenty of people get from their families before being locked up in an asylum or something. It's probably for this reason that Mom sent me to live with my great-uncle just under a year after we had moved into the new house. She gave plenty of reasons. Great-uncle Abel was coming down with Alzheimer's and needed someone to take care of him. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd, which was why we left New York State in the first place. She even let her true colors show a bit the night before I left, snapping, "You're too damn old to be talking to dolls," before hiding her head in her hands and quietly sobbing at the dinner table. I didn't fight it. I had no reason to stay, though I kept thinking to myself what a shame it would be to leave Calliope behind. I spent a few years with Uncle Abel, and for the most part, they were uneventful. Abel's Alzheimer's was more or less easy to deal with, at least for a while, and by this point, I had more or less calmed down. Calliope did that to me, and even though she wasn't here, I could remember her calming presence whenever I found myself getting angry. I found myself missing her, the way someone might miss an old friend with whom they left things unsaid. It was weird. I knew it, but I knew that Calliope was more than just a doll, so it didn't bother me. In the autumn, I'd look up at the golden moon and smile. It reminded me so much of her eyes. At some point, Uncle Abel asked me if I had any girls in my life. Without thinking, I blurted out Calliope's name. "Calliope," Abel repeated, and I was immediately embarrassed. I shook my head and was going to explain it away when he said something that caught me by surprise. I thought she wasn't around anymore. Eventually, Uncle Abel's Alzheimer's became too much for me to handle on my own, and we had to move him into a home. I was 18, didn't have a job, and had no real choice but to move back in with my mom. Mom and I hadn't kept up much since I left, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I came back home. The house was dirty and uncared for, even more than when we had first moved in. Mom had developed a drinking problem while I was gone, the evidence of which was littered all around the house. It was a conscious sort of mess, with empty bottles stacked neatly in corners or on countertops, cared for just enough not to leave them lying about, but not enough to throw them in the garbage. Despite this, or maybe because of it, Mom seemed really happy to have me back. She hugged me tight at the door and welcomed me home. She asked if I wanted anything to eat, despite the fact that the kitchen end was clearly in no shape to cook anything in. "No thanks," I said. "I just want to go to bed." I was half lying, and she could tell. She told me the hallway was kind of a mess. If I didn't want to deal with cleaning it up, I could just sleep on the couch, or on her bed, even, and she'd sleep in the living room. I told her to stop being ridiculous and broke away from her hug. Despite her clear reluctance to let go, I climbed up the stairs, very nearly stepping on an exposed nail at the top step, and turned down the hall to my room. It was packed with boxes, clothes, rolled up carpet, and even furniture. It looked less like the lazy storage solution Mom would have me believe it to be, and more like a barricade. I picked through the stuff easily and approached the door to my old bedroom, only to find myself frozen in place. My hand on the doorknob trembled. I found myself wondering, what if she wasn't in there? What if she was? Which would be worse? I felt riddled with anxiety, thinking of all the things I would have to say and how I would say them. I was worried that Calliope wouldn't understand, wouldn't forgive me. I felt like she would ask where I was all those years, and I wouldn't know how to answer. I swallowed my nerve and opened the door, and there she was, sitting in the corner like she always had, motionless, without a sound, perfect in her stillness. I sat on the bed across from her and held her hand. It was the same painted wood it always had been, but to me, it felt warm, familiar. Calliope was still here, and I was back, and there was nothing that needed to be explained. We were back together, and that was all that mattered. The nightmares started again that night, nails in the floor, something dark, something terrible trying to get into my room, a girl in the backyard, staring up at my window, illuminated by the amber moonlight. The next year or so was rough. Mom and I would break into constant arguments, with almost anything triggering a shouting match. I was tracking mud in the house. I was staying up too late. I was apparently stealing her booze right out from under her nose. Anything would start the argument. But I felt deep down it was always related to the same thing, Calliope. She seemed to hate her, and it drove her crazy how close we were. It became clear to me that the 2 years Mom had spent alone in the house with the doll had taken their toll. She wasn't the same person I grew up with. She was always angry or paranoid, and I would often come home to see her sobbing at the kitchen table. She lost her job, was behind on the mortgage, and almost never allowed herself upstairs. I often wondered what sweet Calliope could be doing to make her so upset. I started to question if the scratches in the furniture and the broken objects littered around the house were my mom's doing after all. I remember needing to get out one night. I ended up going to a party, invited by the friends I made when I was still in school. It was a pretty mediocre get-together, but exactly the break from Mom's manic crazy that I needed. Veronica was there, and to my surprise, still into me, I chatted her up. And when she flirted with me, I flirted back, but the whole time my mind was on Calliope. After a haze of drinks, I was back in my bedroom, and I was so sure I brought Veronica there. I was staring at my feet at the edge of the bed, and was going to turn around and tell her that I just couldn't get it up, when to my surprise I was met with the sight of amber eyes. It was Calliope, laid out on my bed. I knew I hadn't put her there, but here she was. And there Veronica wasn't. I climbed over to her. I reached out to touch her hand and gasped. It didn't feel like wood. It felt like skin, the most perfect, soft, womanly skin I had ever felt. As I looked up her arm, I could see that it was free of the blemishes and chipped paint from before. It was as if a real woman was in my bed, only motionless, and yet I still felt her inviting me forward, asking me to continue without a voice. I looked into Calliope's eyes and she looked back. I cupped her cheek and kissed her, and her lips were the most perfect lips I have ever felt. I knew in that moment what I had felt for so long. I was in love with Calliope, and I didn't care how strange it felt. I knew she loved me back. "I love you," I spoke, more of a moan than a whisper. I felt darkness looming at my door, and at the sound of my words it flew open. Mom stood there in the doorframe, tears staining her face, a bottle in her hand. She screamed at me, asking what I was doing, both of us knowing it was a rhetorical question. I pulled myself off of Calliope and sat up straight at the foot of the bed, embarrassed, but still not letting go of her hand. Mom screamed and sobbed. "Look at you," she shrieked. "In bed with that fucking whore." I was confused, but I was also angry. I stood up and told her to take it back. I shouted at her, shouted that Calliope was not a whore, that she had no right to speak to her like that. In response, Mom pushed past me and chucked the bottle at Calliope's head. I was seeing red now, and I shoved her out of the room and into the hallway. She stumbled a bit, and I was brought back to the reality of the situation a little when I saw her almost tip over. I never once thought I could lay hands on my mother like that. It had never once crossed my mind, never felt possible, and here I had almost pushed her over. I cursed under my breath and slammed the door. I tried to walk right out the front door, down the street, anywhere I could get away from my mother and get my head straight. but she caught me on the stairwell. "Please, don't go," she stammered, tears running down her face and choking her words. "Don't leave me alone here with her. Not now. Not after that." I tried to shoo her off of me, but she latched onto me like her life depended on it. I tried to tell her to calm down, that nothing was going to happen. I said I needed to go, but she just kept shaking her head, sobbing, screaming that she was going to kill her. I shouted at her that it was just one of Grandma's dolls, and nothing else. Something I didn't even believe. How could a doll ever hurt her? I asked. "Because my mother never bought that doll," she shrieked. I was confused and tried to take a step back, but she was latched onto me. She fell quiet for a minute, choking on her own tears, before continuing, trying to be more clear before her panicked, frantic sobbing. "Calliope was your grandmother's maid. That little French whore was always flirting with your father, always giving in to his advances, always." I was immediately stunned by the mention of my dad, and she could see the expression on my face change. Her tone became more frantic, more defensive. I was 16 and pregnant, and he was going to leave me for her, that little slut. So I pushed her down the stairs. She shut her eyes, probably unable to stand the judgment and the shock in my gaze. I pushed her down the stairs, then I buried her with Daddy's cement out back. It was like she was reverting back to that little girl as she spoke. She opened her eyes, which were red from the strain and crying, and shouted in my face, "I killed her, and now she's going to kill me. You can't leave. Dietrich, you can't let her kill me." I was shocked. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and she just kept shaking me, rocking me back and forth as she tugged on my shirt. I whispered for her to stop. Then I said it outright. Then I shouted it and shoved her when she didn't let go. Her grip on my shirt slipped, and she stumbled backward, stepping onto the exposed nail at the top of the staircase. She shrieked in pain and tumbled backward, the nail tearing through her foot as she collapsed down the flight of stairs. I was frozen in shock, watching as she hit every stair on her way to the bottom. I had to catch my breath before I followed her down, slowly ascending every step, careful not to step on the smeared blood and shifting all of my weight on the banister, feeling like I might collapse myself. Mom was laying on the floor at the foot of the staircase, a twisted mess of a person. A hole was torn from the center of her foot outward through her toes. Her neck was crooked, bone jutting out where it bent at an impossible angle. Her right arm was beneath her body, her left one bent backward, and her legs folded. She lay there still, looking like a discarded doll, and if not for her, wheezing could have well played the part. "Please," she whined, staring up at me through the tears and blood in her eyes. "Dietrich, please. Dietrich, please." I clutched my mouth. I was staring at my mother, broken in a way no boy should ever have to see a parent. I was also looking at a murderer, a killer who had just confessed to ending an innocent life out of jealousy. Not just any life, either. My Calliope, who had once lived, only to be robbed from life too early by the woman on the floor in front of me. "Dieter, but please." I looked back and saw Calliope. She was sitting at the top of the staircase, her head leaning against the banister. I looked at her amber eyes, and for once swore I could see something in them. Real emotion. Delight. One look in her eyes and I knew what I had to do. I looked back down at the crippled creature on the floor below me. All pity and fear had left me, and I raised my leg and broke my boot down on her jaw. I dragged my mum's body out the door and stuffed it into the trunk of her Cadillac and let it drift on neutral into a local river. As I watched it sink beneath the inky murk, I remember looking up at the sky, finding it remarkable just how yellow the moon was that night. When I got home, the blood trail leading down the staircase and out the door was completely gone. As I walked up the stairs, I noticed that even the nail jutting out of the top step was missing. The door to my room was open, and there lay Calliope, waiting for me. I held her to my chest and slept dreamlessly through the night. The next day I told the cops what my mom told me. I said she confessed to the murder of a girl about 19 years ago, just before running off with some guy she met at a bar in town. They had their questions, of course, but the forensics on the body dug up in my backyard showed that I would have to be a really murderous baby if I was responsible. Mom apparently made a reputation for herself as a drunk while I was away, and with no signs of struggle, the cops had no trouble believing my story. All of that was back in October. I sold the house to a family friend who reached out not long after Mom went missing, and I hear from him every now and then. Calliope and I are living in a one-bedroom apartment in Beteron now. I think she likes the beach. I'm hoping we can move to France someday, somewhere with a beach. I don't regret what I did, even if I wish my mother was still the person she was before we moved into that house. I know that all of that was a lie. She was a killer the whole time. Anyone who would rob the world of an angel like Calliope deserved what they had coming. I'm making this post because I recently got a call from the guy who bought that old house. He usually calls me every other week, sometimes to check in, ask if I heard from my mom, who is technically wanted for murder, so why would I tell him if I did? And sometimes to ask mundane questions about the house. This time was different though. After his usual small talk, he asked me about the doll I left among my mom's stuff. You know, the one that kind of looks like her, except for the yellow eyes. I'm leaving now, before Mom's doll can get me like Calliope fought her. I'm never setting foot in that house again, and I hope when I'm gone this post can maybe clear things up a bit. I'm not scared though. Cautious, sure, but I have Calliope here to protect me. We're together now, and nothing is going to tear us apart. As I'm writing this, though, I keep glancing out my window. I can't help but feel anxious about how unseasonably yellow the moon is tonight. I don't know how much time I have left, but I feel I need to get this out. Someone needs to understand my mistake. My name is Jean-Paul Allard. I'm 87 years old, and I am going to die. I wouldn't fault anyone if they assumed it was simply age that was catching up with me. But no, most people would never assume I was over 50 when they saw me. Some would say I've lived a good life, and that is the reason for my youth. But I know differently. I know it has to do with them, with those creatures I created all those years ago, the ones that hunt me now. As a child, I spent much of my life around death and dying. I was a child when the Germans came with their monsters and overtook us. I watched family and friends die at their hands as they resisted until their last breath. I ran supplies for the French resistance until the end of the Second Great War, and when it was finally over, my family devoted themselves to trying to return beauty to our beloved France. They were artists, my mother and father. They could see beauty in even the most mundane of things. But all I ever saw was horror. I was young when my home was ravaged, and it left an impression on me that carried over into my adult years. Where my parents could create peace and serenity, I could only make chaos and pain. I did my best to take after them, to see the beauty in all things, but I was raised in a dark time, and I witnessed nothing but darkness for too long. So my work reflected that darkness that I had seen in everything. My parents would still compliment my work, saying they could feel the pain and the hurt being conveyed through my pieces. I told them I wanted to see beauty, and they would reply, "There is beauty in pain, Jean-Paul. Just remember, not all beauty is found in the serene." I continued my artistic pursuits, and at one point I found myself invited to share my pieces at a gallery in New York City. My parents couldn't be prouder. Still, the sorrow and pain I felt remained a predominant part of my life. The horrors of what happened to my people, and the darkness in the years that followed, remained a prominent feature in my formative years. And when I made it to New York, I only discovered new forms of this shadow. The gallery show was a huge success, and I made a decent little stipend. The owner of the gallery, a man with piercing blue eyes by the name of Luciano, informed me that he wanted to see more of my work, and he wanted to commission a few specialty sculptures, to which I gladly agreed. After all, how many could say they made their living as an artist in New York City? Things were going quite well for me, and the shadow was starting to lift. My work took on a brighter tone, and those who had come to enjoy my work were not pleased. They enjoyed that darkness, reveled in the evil I showed them, and I couldn't journey back into the dark. When Luciano inquired about the sudden change in my work, I told him honestly that I had spent a long time seeing nothing but pain and darkness in the world, and now that things were starting to change for the better, I didn't see that dark side of humanity any longer. He told me not to worry about it, that my current work was wonderful, and that I should be proud. There was something about the way he said it, though, like he was trying to smile through gritted teeth. I'm certain he was displeased that I wasn't making him the same money that I had been, but for the first time, I could see the beauty my mother and father created. Then I was attacked. I don't know if Luciano had hired the men or not, but one night as I left the studio, a group of men jumped me in an alley. They beat me within an inch of my life, spewing insults as they assaulted me. I was left lying in an alley, several of my ribs most certainly broken, just like that. The bucket of sunshine that I had started to fill was kicked over, and I was left in the dark again. They came to me in a sort of fever dream. I was recovering in hospital from the beating I had endured, and at some point, I had come down with an infection. I lay in the bed, sweat soaking the pillow when the shadows first took form. They offered me a chance to recover. All they wanted in return was to come to this world, to be given forms by someone who had been touched by horror. I was sick, presumably dying. I shouted that I would do whatever I was asked. I swore I'd create bodies befitting the nightmares they were if they just kept death at bay. The next day I was fine. My injuries had miraculously fully healed, and my fever disappeared. I was kept for observation for a few days, but soon I was back on the street and I had a project to create. I had promised these shadows a body, and for some reason, I believed I owed them. The first draft was terrible. I used stone to try and sculpt my vision of the things I had seen, and I hated it. Every night I dreamt of them, their forms souring my every thought. It was like they wouldn't let me forget them. For the second draft, I used an old weaving technique my grandmother had taught me when I was a child, collecting pliant sticks and weaving them together to form an intricate body and arms. I liked this more than the stone. It created the image that plagued my mind more clearly. Something was still missing, though I couldn't quite place it, but I knew I wouldn't be able to truly bring this sculpture to life without it. The inspiration was found one night after Luciano had visited me. As we were talking, he shooed away a stray black cat, and something in my mind clicked. I realize now that I should never have spilled more blood to create this monster, but it plagued me. One pelt was not enough, and I found myself hunting the dark-furred strays nightly for nearly a month to collect enough to create what I wanted. I used their bones and claws to create the creature's hind legs, and soon enough the first shadow was near completion. I just needed to create its face. I should have stopped. I should have realized the dark path I was walking, but all I've ever known was pain and horror. To me, this was nothing new. It was simply a unique artistic process that I was using to create something wonderful. I should have stopped. I agonized over the perfect face for the creature, eventually purchasing a collection of variously sized taxidermy eyes in an attempt to find the perfect pair. Nothing spoke to me, and the image in my mind never showed its face, so I could no longer rely on it. "Help me," I remember saying to the unfinished, faceless thing. "Help me find your face, please." I passed out after hours of fruitless labor, drifting back into a sea of despair as the muses abandoned me once more. When I woke, I was surprised. There was a small collection of what looked like folded leather sitting next to my desk, alongside a pair of eyes and what looked like an entire bowl full of teeth. As I held up the leather, I marveled at how supple it was, and the tone. It seemed almost human. It was perfect. I stretched the leather over the shape of the creature's head and collected the eyes. They were unique as well, large and bloodshot blue eyes. The plastic even seemed to have some sort of coating on them to give them a better shine. I put them in place, not bothering to give the creature eyelids. It would want to see the world perfectly after all. When I started adding teeth, I just used the entirety of the bowl, realizing too late that there were far too many on this grinning abomination's face. Why give you lips? You are beautiful the way you are. No, I murmured, adding the last few molars to the entity. When I finished, I leaned back and eyed the abomination I had created. It stood at around 4 feet tall, squatting on cat-like legs with humanoid hands. Its whole body was covered in black fur, save for the bald head. There was no nose, and it stared at me with those bloodshot eyes and an unsettling grin. You are magnificent, I murmured, nearly fainting. I created 4 of those monsters in total. Each time it would become easier, the necessary pieces just showing up as I slept. I never showed these grinning creations to anyone. They didn't need to see them. They were mine. My own creations, my own little friends to keep me company. Eventually, I lost contact with Luciano. One day he just stopped coming to the studio, and eventually it closed down. The police said they suspected he was involved with the mob. And just as they were starting to close in on information that could lead to his arrest, he disappeared. I continued to create pieces, my haunting muses now guiding my hand in these dark creations. And with Luciano gone, there was no longer a middleman to pay exorbitant finder's fees to. I amassed a small fortune and retired in the late 90s. I should have been well into my 60s by the time I stopped, but I looked and felt no older than a 30-year-old man. People who slighted me, even in the slightest, would often disappear. I had been questioned by police many times in the 40 years I lived in the city, and each time nothing came of it. It wasn't until I saw them do it that I put it all together. I had invited a lover to my home, and by this time I had amassed a collection of beautiful things. I needed the beauty. It helped with the nightmares I had of these creatures. He admired many of my pieces, but as we entered the studio, I saw them sitting out, staring at us. I was horrified. No one was ever supposed to see them, and when I wasn't working, I had always put them up. What were they doing out? My God, they're hideous, he had exclaimed. Who made those monstrous things? How horrible. They're my muses, I admitted, sullenly. Muses. Those things, they're abominations. You really should burn them. I quickly escorted him from the room as he continued to berate them, shaking my head and ensuring they were really amazing. I wanted him to praise them and love them as I had, but the way he spoke of them made me feel nothing but shame. I glanced over my shoulder, and I could swear they were staring at us. We spent the night together and fell asleep in each other's arms. But when I woke, he was not with me. At first, I tacked it up to him, not wanting to disturb me and leaving in the morning. But then I wandered into the study. There, in the middle of the floor, surrounded by those things I had made, was the body of the man I had brought home. He was covered in cuts and scratches. His nose looked like it had been bitten clean off, but he was still breathing. I could just make out the shallow heaving of his ravaged chest. I shouted, horror in my voice. One of the things turned and looked at me. I felt my stomach climb in my throat as it raised a single, gnarled finger to its lipless grin. I screamed, horrified. I ran as fast as my feet could carry me out of that house, and I kept running. I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? My sculptures have been killing people. I'm certain that would go over wonderfully. No, I had to do something about them. I had to stop them. I must have been 3 blocks away from the house when I finally collected myself enough to go back. When I returned, I marched straight into the study, only to find the body gone and any sign of the attack gone with it. I stomped over to the cabinet I kept them in and flung it open. They were sitting there, lifeless, but still staring at me. All this time, I murmured, all this time you've been taking lives. None of the sculptures moved or acknowledged me. I collected one of them and hauled it into the backyard. I coated the thing in lighter fluid from the charcoal grill and set fire to it. I stared at the thing as it burned, yet it continued to do nothing, like it was mocking me. So I burned the rest of them that same night. None of them ever reacted to my actions, pretending that I didn't see what I had seen that morning. When the last of them was a charred pile of ashes, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was free, That night, my dreams were filled with those creatures. Visions of them slaughtering countless people and just wandering back into the cupboard at night and pretending like they did nothing. I couldn't get the sight of the one who silenced me out of my head. I was awakened by a crash in my study. I shot up and looked at my door. Had someone broken in? Slowly, I pulled myself out of bed and grabbed the bat I kept nearby for such occasions. Quietly, I crept, not wanting to startle the intruder, but when I arrived in the study, there was no man to be found. I searched the room and found nothing, until I glanced upon the canvas that I had set out. Upon it, written in ash, were the words, "It's not that easy." My stomach sank, and I turned to face the cabinet. Slowly, I opened those cupboard doors, and to my horror, there they Saturday. Those freakish little monsters with their lidless, bulging eyes and too many toothed grins stared at me. Whatever beauty I had seen in these monsters had vanished the moment I discovered their purpose. The darkness I had poured into them. "So you are my curse," I murmured, shaking my head. "Fine, then I will bear you, but you will never harm another, not so long as I can do something about it." I don't know why I resolved to simply let them be, but if burning them down to nothing wouldn't destroy them, then I had a feeling nothing truly would. For over a year, I tried to figure out a way to stop these things, to control them, but nothing seemed to work. I sealed them in glass cases, locked cabinets, and even tried to bury them. They simply kept coming back. Eventually, I built a room in my basement, a sort of twisted display case that I kept them locked away in. Their bulging gaze always haunted me. Every time I journeyed down there, I could feel them watching me, a malice building in their stares, so I wrapped their eyes in gauze. I sealed them in a room all their own and blinded them, and it seemed to work. For 10 long years, I didn't feel their hate. For 10 years, I left them in the dark and alone, and in those 10 years, I began to feel the first onset of aging, as if whatever twisted gift they had given me was finally beginning to fade. I never left home. I became a sort of recluse trying to keep these monsters at bay. I boarded the basement door, chained it, and placed a heavy shelf in front of it in an attempt to seal the prison for these grinning bastards. I spent 10 years having my groceries delivered to my front door, and I had amassed a small fortune so I didn't need to work. My only connection to the outside world was the television and the computer. Those were the loneliest 10 years of my life. I needed someone. I no longer sought love, but instead I wanted someone to speak to, just an ear to listen and an eye to admire the vast treasures I had collected. So I put out a job offer on one of those gig apps. One young man accepted, Alan. He was a kind boy, and he helped me keep my home clean. In return, I paid well. It was nice to have someone present again. During one of his cleanings, he had moved the shelf I had used to hide the basement door, and he inquired about it. Why would I board up and chain this door, then place such a heavy shelf in front of it? When he inquired, I felt that malice again. This time it nearly overwhelmed me. They had simply been waiting, as if they knew they'd be let loose. I urged him to let it go, that nothing good existed down there, only the past and dark memories. He seemed to understand and accept my plea. He even helped me push the shelf back into place. I thought that was the end of it. Even the hatred coming from down below began to fade again. I wish that was where the story concluded, that Alan hadn't done what he did, but he was a young man and curiosity is hard to escape. My time with Alan helped me to realize that life was too short to spend it trying to just be a jailer to these monsters. I had to get out again, to journey into the public eye and spend time amongst the people. I spent the day shopping and even purchased a new car. Then I chose to go to a nearby gallery opening. I had a wonderful time, and the people there truly had a passion for the artistic. I had even met another man who I had promised I'd see again. Things were going the right way, finally. Then I came home. When I entered, I was overcome by the wave of hate that permeated throughout my home, and I soon saw why. The basement had been unsealed, the chains broken, the boards torn away, and the shelf moved. I rushed down the stairs and found Alan staring at them. He had removed the gauze from their eyes, and there was nothing but curiosity in his gaze. but it soon turned to regret and guilt as he saw me. "Oh, Mr. Allard, I'm so sorry. I only shook my head and offered a calm smile. I understand. My boy, were I your age, my curiosity likely would have gotten the better of me, too. These things, I murmured, turning to face them. These grinners, they are a memory I wish to forget. So I sealed them away. I could feel their hateful gaze on me, but I continued to speak as though they were just pieces of art. You should leave. Alan. I glanced at him as he grabbed his collection of tools and ran back up the stairs. My eyes drifted back to the fiends I had made. I can't escape you, can I? It's not that easy. I smiled grimly and turned to leave. I knew their eyes were still on me, and it no longer mattered. That night, I was awakened by a soft tapping at my window. It was strange. I slept on the second story of my house, and there were no trees outside. So when I went to the window, I half expected the man I had met at the gallery tossing pebbles to wake me. Call it hopeless romanticism, or just pure naivety. But when all you have for 10 years are stories to read and watch, you begin to fantasize about those sorts of things. I tossed my curtains to the side and nearly fell backward. There, clinging to the glass and lightly tapping against it, was one of those grinners. When we locked eyes, it raised a single clawed finger to its lipless mouth as it had done so long ago. This time, though, it breathed onto my window and scratched a single word into the fog. Alan. My eyes widened. I rushed over to my phone and called him immediately. It was the middle of the night. I don't know what I expected. "Hello?" came the bleary answer, sleep still clinging to the voice as it desperately tried to pull him back down. Alan, please listen to me. They are coming for you. You need to leave, to run. Do not stop until you are far from here. Mr. Allard, what are you? There was a crash from somewhere on his side of the line. Hello. I heard him call through the receiver. I didn't know if I was too late. But then I turned to look at the window again. The grinning fiend was still there, but the fogged word had changed. You. I wasted no time. I gathered a few things and ran from that house. I ran to my new car. I drove for what must have been hours. I must have tried to get a hold of Alan at least 10 times during that drive, but there was never an answer. I don't know if they managed to take him, but I know they're coming for me. Every night since that fateful evening, I've heard a soft tapping at whatever window or door is nearby. I know they're just playing with me. I know they're waiting for the right chance, but that's not my worry anymore. I know that someday soon they will take me. But then what? They've been my charge for over half a century. Will they find someone new? Or are they simply free to do as they please now? Whatever the case, I am sorry. I woke in the middle of the night to find my boyfriend sitting on the end of our bed, staring into the dark corner of our bedroom. I called out to him groggily, "Jack." He didn't respond. "Jack." I called again. He was still and completely silent. I moved to the end of the bed and looked at him. The look on his face froze my blood. It's as though he wasn't there. His eyes were wide open. His pupils were like dinner plates as he stared endlessly at the dark corner of our room. Needless to say, nothing like this had happened before. Jack wasn't a sleepwalker. He usually slept through the night just fine. No tossing or turning or even grinding his teeth. He was gripping his knees with both hands. I reached out and gently put my hand on his. I swept his brown hair out of his eyes and softly said, "Jack, let's go back to bed." I wasn't trying to wake him. They say you're not supposed to wake a sleepwalker. I was trying to guide him back under the covers, but suddenly he snapped out of it, and the life came back into his eyes, and he looked me. "Haley." He was clearly confused. "I woke up and found you sitting here on the end of the bed. You looked completely out of it," I said. "Damn. Really? That's creepy." He blinked a lot and looked around the room. "Let's go back to bed," I said. And we did. We got up a couple hours later. Around 5 a.m., Jack was working crazy hours. He would go in at 6 and work 12 to 16 hours before dragging himself back home. We assumed that was the reason for his strange behavior, so we made a plan to get to bed earlier. He got home around 9 p.m. and went immediately to bed. I joined him a couple hours later. I slid under the covers. He turned over and put his arm around me, and I was out. I woke up with a start this time. Again, Jack was sitting on the end of the bed, staring into the corner. "Jack," I hissed at him. I'll admit that this time I was not in the mood. It's selfish, I know, but I just wanted to sleep. I managed to pull myself out of bed. I sat down next to him. Again, his eyes were fixed on the dark, far corner of our bedroom. I grabbed his knee and gently shook it. "Jack, we have to go back to..." Then Jack said something. It sounded like swan. I leaned in close to him, fully awake now and chills going up my arm. "What did you say?" "Jack." "Swan. I was ready to give up and pull him back to bed rather than sit up and try to translate gibberish, but then he raised his hand. He extended his index finger and pointed into the dark corner, and he whispered, "He's watching us." A shock of fear ran through my body like lightning. I slowly turned from Jack to the corner where he pointed. I stared into the darkness but saw nothing. What did I expect to see then? A ghost. Then I jumped up and moved to the side of the bed and snapped on the lamp on the side table. I looked over at the corner of the room one more time to be sure. There was nothing there. Did it happen again? Jack was looking at me, blinking his eyes rapidly with a kind of anguish on his face. I remember it this time. I sat next to him on the bed. I could see the bedroom, but I couldn't move. "Sleep paralysis," I said. He nodded. It was as if something was forcing me to stare into the corner. I was just staring into the darkness until I began to see something emerge from the wall. He looked terrified. "It was a nightmare," I said. I rubbed his back and kissed him. "It felt like I was conjuring something," he added. "A nightmare," I repeated. "Let's go back to bed." Beep, beep, beep. It was Jack's alarm on his phone. It was 5 a.m. and time for him to get ready to go to work, even on a Saturday. "Fuck," Jack groaned. "I'll start the coffee," I said as I made my way down the hall. I decided not to tell Jack what he was saying in the night. He's watching us. It was probably nothing anyway, just a nightmare. I handed Jack his travel mug of black coffee, gave him a kiss, and watched him step out the door into the still, dark morning. I had the day off from work. After some coffee and reading, it was time to get the house in order. I started in the bedroom. I was making the bed when I got a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like I was being watched. I looked over at the corner of the room and almost screamed. On the corner walls of the room was what looked like the silhouette of a man. It was an outline of a full body. There was clearly a head, shoulders and torso cast onto the corner of the room. I watched the figure for a second, and something seemed off about it, apart from the obvious strangeness of its presence in general. The figure did not seem like a shadow, but more like an image imprinted on the wall. I slowly walked over to the corner and placed my hand on the wall. I don't know why. When I pulled my hand away, it was covered in a dark dust. I looked closely at the dark image. Then I wiped my rag across it. The dust came away onto the rag and powdered into the air. It looked like ash. I wet the rag and wiped the rest of the shadow figure off the wall. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't you just leave the fucking house? The short answer is, we did. I spent that whole day alone in the house. I spent that whole day thinking about those words that Jack had said in the night. He's watching us. Then I spent the whole day thinking about that ashen shadow figure on the wall. Then I booked us a hotel room. Jack arrived home at about 9 p.m. and I already had everything packed. "What's going on?" Jack asked. "I got us a room at the Skyview for the night." He dropped his backpack on the floor. "Did something happen?" "I just thought a change of scenery might help you sleep through the night." I don't know, I'm pretty tired already. I was already rolling the suitcase out the front door. The room is already booked and paid for. I'll drive. I called back to him. I didn't tell him that in the suitcase was a new set of lingerie and heels I had ordered a few days ago. I woke up hours later in a king-sized hotel bed, now wearing nothing but sheer nylon thigh highs. The TV was still on and flickering in the corner of the room. Through my bleary vision, I could see the digital clock on the side table, which read 3 a.m. I shot up and reached over to the other side of the bed. I felt Jack's chest. Thank God. I settled into him and closed my eyes. Then I felt Jack's head turn toward me. He made a sound. "What?" I whispered. What I heard next made my blood run cold. "He's watching us." I shot up and looked around the room, and then I saw it. The TV in the corner was now showing nothing but static. Somehow something about it looked off, as if the little static particles were behaving in coordinated patterns of movement. Then I saw it. Within the static, I could see the dark figure of a head and shoulders. It looked just like the shadow figure that appeared in our bedroom. I could barely make out any features, but from the outline of the figure, I could tell it was smiling. He was watching us and he was smiling. "Jack, wake up." Jack didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on the shadowy thing on the TV screen. "Jack, wake up." I shouted this time and shook his arm. Jack, he didn't even stir. I remembered the TV remote was on the side table.
I slowly reached over, keeping my eyes on the man in the static all the while.
I felt the remote with the tip of my fingers. I gripped it and quickly mashed the power button. The screen went dark and so did my vision. My eyes flicked around the pitch-black darkness. My vision adjusted and all I saw was the shadowy hotel room. I turned to wake Jack and my heart nearly stopped. Jack wasn't there. He wasn't in the bed. Then I saw him. Jack was standing in front of the TV in corner of the room. Even in the near complete darkness, I could see his unblinking bloodshot eyes staring right at me. A dead smile was plastered on his face. "Jack, Jack, wake up," I squeaked. He slowly moved across the room. It looked as though his body wasn't working correctly. He moved like a marionette, twitching and lurching across the room towards me. I looked around for some form of weapon. I chose the telephone on the side table. I pulled the cord from the receiver and held it up like a club. "Don't come any closer, Jack." His rigor mortis smile continued its slow movement towards me in the darkness. Suddenly, he was only 2 steps away. I stepped forward and swung the phone, connecting hard with the side of his head. I know that the thing I just hit with the phone was not Jack. Not really, but I could feel that my Jack was still in there somewhere. Jack was the love of my life. When I hit him, I couldn't help feeling regret. After I hit him, I hesitated, not for long, but long enough for him to turn back towards me and reach a hand for my throat. I backed away at the last second and bolted for the door. It was too late. He caught me by the arm. The last thing I remember was my scream being choked out by a hand gripping my throat and squeezing hard. I woke up in our bedroom. I was on my knees, bound with duct tape around my ankles, wrists and mouth. In front of me was Jack. He was kneeling facing the dark corner of our bedroom. His head was flung back and he was rapidly whispering something. It looked as though he was in prayer or some kind of religious fervor. Then I saw it. The dark shadows in the corner of the bedroom seemed to darken even more. A shape emerged, a head, then shoulders and arms. At first the shape appeared as a silhouette, then it seemed to emerge from the wall and take solid form. A face was coming through our bedroom wall, and it was darker than dark and smiling a horrible smile, the same smile I saw plastered across Jack's face. Jack's whispering became more urgent. He spread his arms out to either side. The dark thing opened its eyes. They were pitch black. Its arms emerged from the wall. They were long, and its hands extended out into narrow, endless fingers. It reached out and put its hands around Jack's throat. I tried again to scream. The thing's hands moved up and gripped Jack's head, then with one quick motion snapped his head around completely. I'll never forget the look on Jack's face. He was smiling. I screamed and cried. The dark thing pulled Jack into the corner of the room and somehow pulled him through the wall. Jack's body was gone, and I was left alone in the bedroom screaming through the duct tape on my mouth. I toppled onto my side and screamed until my voice box shattered, and then I kept screaming. I slammed my knees into the ground, making as much noise as possible. I don't know how long it was before the police showed up. They asked me what happened. I couldn't speak after screaming for hours, so I had to write it all down on one of their notepads. I told them what I am now telling you.
They didn't say as much, but they clearly didn't believe me.
Jack's fingerprints were on the duct tape that I was bound with, and technically, he is the one that did that attack and restrained me. My claim that he was under some kind of supernatural possession to them just read as a defense mechanism against the domestic abuse that they believed I had suffered. Every so often, an officer checks in with me to see if I know where Jack is, or if I've heard from him. They believe he's on the lam somewhere. I'm living with my family now. I sleep with all the lights on if I'm lucky enough to sleep at all. Lately, there's been power outages in the neighborhood. They didn't start until I started living with them. I don't know why that thing took Jack and didn't take me. I can only assume that one of these nights it will come back. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.